All right, good morning, fifth grade. Yesterday, you guys started learning about the four parts that we find in our blood. Go ahead and let's say them with me, starting with the most liquidy part of it that's more like this yellow fluid. What's that called again? Starts with a P. That's right, plasma. And then we have the parts of our blood that actually carries the oxygen, and they have a specific color that's red. What are those called? Red blood cells, that's right. And they're red because of the iron that's attached to them. Then we have the ones that are like the boxers, the fighters. They fight all of our diseases. And what were those called? The white blood cells, that's right. And then we have this things that you'll learn what they are later. I haven't told you exactly what they do yet, but it starts with the P. Those are the platelets. Very good. And our blood has several purposes for us. It keeps our temperature at a nice 98 degrees so that we don't overheat and we don't freeze to death. It transports different things like nutrients and sugars and proteins to all different parts of our body, as well as oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then it also does what third thing? Who can tell me? Yeah, it also helps fight against infections. To keep us healthy. So anyone who has a compromised immune system, meaning their white blood cells don't work as well, anytime they're around someone who is sick, they could easily get sick because their white blood cell count is not where it should be. We talked about how in one drop of blood, there's so many different parts to so many different red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets that are inside of that. So today specifically, we're going to be talking about our red blood cells and specifically what they do and how they help our bodies. So let's look at our slideshow. All right, our red blood cells. These are tiny blood cells that carry oxygen to all parts of the body. That is their main job. When they signed up to work for you, their job description is, hey, let's get oxygen where it needs to go. So each red blood cell is actually this concave disc. Okay, everyone see how they kind of like if it was flat and someone just took their fingers and pinched it so that it's concave, it dips in on both sides. This shape is a specific purpose. How cool is this? Let's think about this. God designed these red blood cells with a specific purpose. This is not accidental that our red blood cells are that shape. There is a specific purpose to that shape. So what does it do? This shape helps them squeeze through small capillaries without actually bursting. So we don't want our red blood cells to burst open because they're carrying that oxygen that our body needs. So that shape helps them bend and squeeze and twist without bursting. Now, each red blood cell acts like a bus that's traveling on a route through the body. So each red blood cell, if you can picture it as like a bus, and when it gets to the lungs, it lets oxygen in, and when it gets to the capillaries that it needs to go to, at the different stops, the red blood cell lets oxygen out and it picks up that carbon dioxide. And when that bus is traveling through the lungs, it lets out that carbon dioxide and it picks up that oxygen all over again. Now, yes, the red blood cells are like buses, but they're like buses that don't stop, okay? In the process of them picking up oxygen and dropping oxygen off at capillaries and picking up the carbon dioxide to bring back, they don't slow down, they don't stop, they just keep going. So you can kind of picture it like this. Those red blood cells are going around the capillaries, making a U-turn, dropping off the oxygen, picking up the carbon dioxide, and continuing on their way back up to the lungs to drop off that carbon dioxide and pick up more oxygen. They are moving swift, fast, and in a hurry. I don't know about you, but that looked pretty fun to be able to ride like that. So our red blood cells are constantly moving through our body, but they don't slow down. They have this really cool shape as if I was to pinch it on either side, but it helps them to bend and squeeze to get through those tiny capillaries. Because remember, do you remember the size of the capillaries that we talked about? That if we could take one piece of hair and split it how many times? If you can email me the answer, I'll give you bonus points. How many times can I split a human hair to equal the size of one capillary? We talked about this a while ago. That'll be bonus. Email it to me. Don't post it. Now, yesterday I talked about how a little bit how our red blood cells, where they are produced. We talked about inside the bone marrow. So here's a picture of a bone where this is actually a femur, so that's your big thigh bone, okay? Red blood cells are made in the bone marrow, which is in the center of the bone, right here, this big yellow chunk that runs the whole length of the bone. And there's about 100 million red blood cells that are produced every single minute. Think about that. 100 million red blood cells produced every minute. Now think about why that's so necessary. Remember how many millions of red blood cells are in one drop of blood? So our bones are constantly making new blood. Now if the body doesn't produce enough red blood cells, a person could develop what we call anemia or become anemic. So people who become anemic, they have several symptoms that, let me scroll down a little bit. There we go. It often makes them feel dizzy at times, and these symptoms are caused by a lack of oxygen throughout the body. So with fewer red blood cells, and you can see this is a normal level of blood cells right here. Someone who is anemic would have about this much. I experienced this 2 times in my life. The first time was when I gave birth to my son, Gunnar. The second time, you guessed it, when I gave birth to the twins, Gareth and Sophia. Usually in that process, some women can become anemic. And you know what the doctor told me? He said, go eat a hamburger, because red meat will produce, is high in proteins, and it also helps you produce more red blood cells. So guess what I did? I went out and ate 2 hamburgers. All right. So with fewer red blood cells, there's not as much oxygen that can be carried by the blood. So someone who is anemic, here's that word right there, anemic, is going to have less red blood cells in their body. So each red blood cell lives about 120 days. 120 days. And as those red blood cells get older, think about an old person. As they get older, they get a little more frail. They start to break bones sometimes. Well, red blood cells are kind of the same way. If you can think of like an older person and how they age, our red blood cells do the same thing. So as our red blood cells get older, they lose their shape. And remember how crucial that shape is to them. Here's our normal red blood cell. This is our damaged red blood cell. They lose their shape and become fragile. And they shrink in size, and they are carried to the spleen or the liver. Those are 2 organs in your body. And there, they are destroyed. That's like the garbage heap of red blood cells, our spleen and our liver. Get rid of the ones that are dying and not helping anymore. Most parts of the old red blood cell, but guess what? They're recycled by the body and used to make new blood cells. So our old ones, they die, but they're put back into use and recycled. All right, for all my mathematicians out there, I got a good math problem for you. Inside of each of our red blood cell, we have a protein called hemoglobin. Now, remember when we talked about the blood plasma, how plasma breaks down proteins into usable things to transport them? Well, part of that is the protein called hemoglobin. So let's look at this science and math. Now, inside each red blood cell, again, this is our word right here, hemoglobin. Oxygen from the lungs attaches itself to that hemoglobin. So we have oxygen that gets picked up, but in order for it to be carried in a red blood cell, it has to attach itself to hemoglobin molecules. In this way, oxygen is carried to each part of the body. Together, the hemoglobin and oxygen gives blood its bright red color, and we talked about that yesterday. Here's our math, guys, so get your thinking caps on. Each red blood cell has about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. Let me say it again. One red blood cell has about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. Each of these 250 million molecules can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. So 250 times 4. Each red blood cell, this is 1 drop of blood, each red blood cell carries about 1 billion oxygen molecules throughout the capillaries and throughout your body. Anyone else's mind blown? Right? 1 drop of blood has 1 billion oxygen molecules in them. That's crazy. No one can say, well, I mean, people say it all the time, but man, our body and everything inside of our body was made with a purpose, and that was not by accident. All right, I want to finish with 2 pictures. First off, this is a bunch of red blood cells under a microscope that's magnified to a crazy amount. It's an electron microscope, but you can see how they are concave. Concave means to dip inwards, okay? And you can see that these are all concave. One of these is 1 red blood cell, which means it has 1 billion oxygen molecules inside of it. So this is the first picture I want to show you, but let's look even closer. These are red blood cells magnified even closer. And you can see, actually, if you look in the background, you can see some really cool, they're inside the arteries there. But here is more of the red blood cells. You can see that they are, they're not old, they're not falling apart. You can see that they're easily bendable. You see this one right here, bendable so that they can squeeze through these small capillaries. And again, they're not old because they're not frail or falling apart. So these are healthy red blood cells. Now, if this was a picture of a person who's anemic, what would we find with these red blood cells? Yeah, there wouldn't be as many. There would be fewer because remember, someone who is anemic have fewer red blood cells. Your assignment for today is to comment below with 2 things that you learned about red blood cells. And then also, I want to give you guys the opportunity, if you have any questions about what we've learned about the parts of the blood and specifically about red blood cells, leave that question below too, and I will discuss it and give you a shout out in the next day's video, so Monday's video. Again, talked about red blood cells and the parts of the blood. On Monday, I will answer any questions that you have, and I will we'll start discussing our white blood cells and how they're the soldiers of our body. All right, guys, I love you and I miss seeing you. Again, leave 2 things that you learned about red blood cells. Bye.